Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you tonight. And for the meeting earlier, we learned a lot from it on how a community that is taking the first steps in implementing the Planet Youth methodology and their work in a community. Well, that was very interesting, and we, my colleagues, which is Hlynur over there, raise your hand. He is our Consul General in Winnipeg, and Per Unheim, which is our Political and Trade Officer at the embassy. So, dear guests, it takes a village to raise a child. I'm born in 1967, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s in a small town next to Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, called Kópavogur. Kópavogur, when I was growing up, was between 10 to 15,000 people, a young town, attractive to young families with children, with plenty building land, affordable housing, and close to the capital. It was wonderful growing up in Kópavogur. The freedom was intensive. Up to 10 years old, we were allowed to stay out by law until 10 p.m. in the evening in summers. And we did. It was safe, fun, filled with kids, endless games and adventures. Kópavogur was the birth town of the punk music in Iceland. And I, for example, I started listening to the Sex Pistols when I was 10 in 1977. I heard my first punk LP, and I was hooked. Kópavogur, I said, young town, young families, social problems, anger, frustration, etc. So it was not all a rosy picture of freedom and being able to be outside to 10 p.m. in the evenings in the summer. There were also problems. It had problems partly due to lack of infrastructure and support for kids and teenagers at home, in schools, and outside of schools. There were no after-school programs. You left after school. Parents might or might not be at home when you came home, and you were left to your own devices. Community centers that focused on teenagers were in their infancy and did not fit all. My hangout when I was 12, 13, up to 14, 15, was a place called Skiptistöðin in Icelandic in Kópavogur. It was an underground tunnel leading to the main bus stop in the town. That is where the punks hang out. That was our place after school, in the evenings and on weekends. I was just telling my colleagues that the mistake that the town of Kópavogur did actually was that they kept the heat on in that tunnel. If they had pulled it in the winter, we would probably have left. But anyway, so teenage drinking and smoking were high in Iceland in the 80s, and drug use in a steep rise in the 90s. We did not see a lot of drugs as kids at the time in Kópavogur, and the kids, they drank alcohol and they sniffed glue. That was happening in the 80s. Especially the younger ones, 10 to 13 years old or so, and after 13, 14 years old, it was alcohol and later pot and pills. The earliest memory I have of a drunk classmate was at the age of 11, when he showed up drunk for a swimming class one afternoon. We did not think anything of it. He was drunk. It was a tiny bit cool, I think some thought, but it was also sad, and none of us actually wanted to be in his steps. But for that kid, there was really no úrræði. There was no, he couldn't go anywhere. His only place to go after that experience was just to go home. So for those kids, there was, as I said, no úrræði, as we say in Iceland. There were no resources or facilities to deal with drug or alcohol abuse. The support system was weak, and the kids really did not have trust in what was offered. Someone I knew had to go to the school's psychologist at some time, and the psychologist asked that kid how long it would take him to empty the bathtub with a spoon. Really, I said. Yes, he said. I told the psychologist to pull the blasted bath plug himself, and I left. The story circulated, and no one would ever have been caught dead going to the school's psychologist after that. Preventive measures that had been used to educate young people about the dangers of drug use, smoking, and alcohol abuse did not seem to work properly. Whatever was being done did not reach kids in a meaningful way. What the story about the bathtub plug and the psychologist tells us is that there needs to be trust and mutual respect between the partners. The approach needs to be right, and the understanding that it takes a village to raise a child needs to be in place. That is what was about to change in Iceland. The necessary cooperation of stakeholders, the village was forming with parents, teachers, community centers, sports clubs, etc. In 1997, a group of social scientists, policymakers, and people working with children and young people in the field came together and sought to formulate policies and work based on research that could reverse the trend. The aim of this collaboration was to map the social factors that influence young people's drug use and to design measures that could be applied in the prevention work. To give you an understanding, and we saw some of that on the slide here earlier, how things changed in Iceland in 1998. When asked if they had been drunk the past 30 days, 42% of the teenagers aged 15 and 16 in Iceland answered yes, compared to 6% in the year 2012. So from 42% down to 6%. 98, 42, 2012, 6. And it has stayed at that level, 6 to 7% since then. Same goes for smoking, which went from 23% daily smoking in 1998 down to 1% in 2020. 1% that claimed that they smoked daily. Smoking really does not exist anymore with that age group. Cannabis is the same story, down from 17% to 6% in 20 years. If you compare Iceland to the other Nordics, statistics from 2019 tell us that only 3.8% of Icelandic teenagers said that they had been drunk at some time the prior 30 days, compared to 40% in Denmark and 10 to 13% in the other Nordics. The work continues, and in Iceland it is about keeping those numbers down and assisting other communities outside of Iceland, in South America, in Europe, and here in Canada to reach their goals, to create that village and help our kids to survive today's challenges. Thank you.